We will now make the case against the documentary hypothesis. General observation. The kind of scissors and paste editing that Wellhausen assumed is unparalleled in literary history and is intrinsically unlikely. It also has unrealistic assumptions about how consistent writers have to be. The documentary hypothesis assumes that a writer never makes a statement twice over, never allows himself a digression, always sticks to the point, never makes a statement that's difficult to reconcile with something else he said, even in the smallest matter. Well, this is simply untrue of all writers of literature, ancient and modern. My teacher Hanan Brichto used to say that the documentary hypothesis, he was a Jewish scholar at Hebrew Union College where I did my doctoral work. He said that the documentary hypothesis assumes that the editors were idiots. These editors, redactor JE, redactor D, redactor P, are said to have done nothing to fix the contradictions. Well, an editor that doesn't fix contradictions is simply a bad editor. Wellhausen assumes that J and E and P were completely self-consistent before being combined with the other sources, but they were put so in a way, they were combined by a mindless editor that didn't try to harmonize it all. Whybray puts it this way. Whybray is interesting because he's a liberal, but he rejects the documentary hypothesis. Thus, the hypothesis can only be maintained on the assumption that while consistency was the hallmark of the various documents, inconsistency was the hallmark of the redactors. This kind of editing, the scissors and paste type editing, is unparalleled. No ancient literary work is known to have evolved the way Wellhausen thinks that the Pentateuch grew. Some have pointed to Tatian's Diatessaron, a harmony of the four Gospels in the 2nd century, but that's not a particularly good analogy. One is centuries after the Pentateuch, is in Greek culture rather than Semitic, and it was taking texts that were already canonized and combining them, whereas J and E and D presumably had not been canonized at that point. The Temple Scroll among the Dead Sea Scrolls has similar inconsistencies to the Pentateuch, but most Dead Sea Scroll scholars think that it's a work of a single author. The unity of theme, moreover, around the promise to the patriarchs suggests that mindless editing did not in fact take place. The promise to Abraham of land and seed and blessing is one of the unifying themes of the Pentateuch, but it crisscrosses across Wellhausian source divisions. Hence, the editors seem to be something other than scissors and paste collectors of material, but they're acting more like authors. Now I turn to testing the pillars of the documentary hypothesis. And we're going to argue that each of the pillars is unsound upon testing. Begin with the first pillar, the divine names. Why do some passages in Genesis use Yahweh and others use Elohim? Cassuto gives an answer that does not involve sources. The names are not interchangeable, but certain contexts will prefer one designation for deity over the others. Technically speaking, only one of these terms is a name. Yahweh is God's personal name. Elohim is actually a title, which would mean God or deity. But you can choose to use either Yahweh in certain contexts or Elohim in certain other contexts in a way that has nothing to do with sources. How is it that Yahweh and Elohim differ? Cassuto puts it this way, that Yahweh is God's personal name. It'll be used when emphasizing God's personal and ethical attributes. It'll be used of God in a context of covenant or personal faith. It'll be used of God when God is dealing personally with people. Personal name, personal context. Elohim, on the other hand, is a more general title for deity. It'll be used when speaking of God as creator and source of life of the whole world. It'll be used when you're referring to God with no special emphasis. It'll refer to God when emphasizing his transcendence, when he seems remote from people. And it'll be the way that non-Israelites are likely to refer to God. If you accept the distinction that Cassuto makes, well, that largely explains the usage. So Genesis 1, you have the 6 days of creation that uses Elohim. Why? Well, it's emphasizing God as transcendent creator of the whole world. In Genesis 2 and 3, it switches to an expression Yahweh Elohim, Lord God. Why? Well, now it's a more personal context, emphasizing God's personal covenant dealings with mankind. Elohim is added because the text wants to make sure that you understand that Yahweh is completely identical with Elohim or God mentioned in chapter 1. Genesis 4, having to do with Cain and Abel, also uses Yahweh because, again, God is dealing personally with people. In Genesis 5, the genealogy of Seth uses Elohim because it emphasizes God as creator of the whole world and is alluding to Genesis 1 in that regard. In Genesis 6, 1 through 4, the passage about the sons of God and the daughters of man, it will switch back to Yahweh, especially in verse 3 because of God's personal striving with man. Again, it's God in a personal relationship context. The flood account mixes Yahweh and Elohim. In certain contexts, they can be used interchangeably. In Genesis 9, 20 through 27, it uses Yahweh with Shem, but Elohim with Japheth. Why? Because out of Shem comes Israel, the people that God establishes a personal covenant relationship with. Whereas out of Japheth will come the nations, various other nations, and hence God to him is the more distant deity. Now this is all based on Cassuto. Whybray refines what Cassuto has said a bit, and I accept his refinement of it. Usage has a combination of theological, stylistic, and unconscious bases. Theologically, there may be a distinction between Yahweh and Elohim. They're not interchangeable terms. They don't mean quite the same thing. Stylistically, certain synonyms simply are not used interchangeably. In English, you can say your coffee is too strong, but no one would ever say your coffee is too powerful, even though powerful and strong can in certain contexts be synonyms. And it may be difficult to understand why a word is or is not used in a particular context. Even professors like me will refer to God sometimes as Yahweh or sometimes as Lord or sometimes as God, and if you ask me, I probably couldn't tell you exactly why I've switched from one to the other. Now what about Exodus 6, 2 through 4? Did the patriarchs know the name Yahweh? A teacher of mine, Gleason Archer, argued yes. They knew the name, but they didn't know its significance. I prefer, however, the view of Gordon Wenham, who said, well, no, the name Yahweh was introduced by the narrator, that is, we could say Moses. And it was a way of showing that the God of the patriarchs was the same as Yahweh worshipped later by the Israelites. You get a hint of this in Genesis 16:11, where Ishmael means El, or God hears, but the narrator explains that you shall call his name Ishmael because Yahweh has listened to your affliction. So it's introducing the name Yahweh to identify El Shaddai, or the El of the patriarchs, with Yahweh. From what we have said, I believe we have established that the first pillar is not particularly sound. What about the second pillar? The pillar of language and style. Well, a general response is, why couldn't an Israelite author vary his style and choice of words from passage to passage, depending on his purpose and message? Moreover, why couldn't an author break up a lengthy story with a digression? And not could not that digression have been a part of his style rather than evidence of sources? One can have variations in language and style without positing different authors or different sources. Does different vocabulary demand different authors? Cassuto argues that, like the divine names, some of these word pairs are not really interchangeable, but some will be preferable in some contexts, while others will be preferable in other contexts. For example, is there a real difference between create and form? Well, you use the word bara, create, when you don't mention the material out of which you create something. Whereas form, yatsar, you will tend to use when you're referring to the material. You form from something using potter clay type imagery, actually. And so the choice is what you want to say, not the sources. What about Amorite or Canaanite? Whybray suggests that these terms may have had connotations that now escape us, connotations that led to different terms being used in different contexts. What about cut or establishing covenants? Karat means to cut a covenant. Even though they both translate make. Hakim means to establish, a hiphil of kum if you're into Hebrew. Well, it means two different things, says Cassuto. To cut a covenant is to give certain assurances. That is, if you make this covenant with me, I will do X, Y, and Z. But to establish a covenant means the actual fulfillment of what was assured. To confirm a covenant, that is giving X, Y, or Z. Or sometimes it's renewing a covenant. The point is that these terms may well not be simply interchangeable. Arguments from style can also go against the JEDP theory. P and J have identical styles, says Whybray. P has a style that cannot be distinguished from J other than the divine name. And as Whybray puts it, this fact is generally unperceived, ignored, or implausibly explained away by writers on this subject. Another factor, after the exile, Aramaic became a very important language and influencing even Hebrew. If P were really a post-exilic work, you would expect it to show more Aramaic influence, but it does not show any Aramaic influence. The lack of Aramaisms suggests a pre-exilic date for P. Thus, the second pillar from language and style also proves unsound. But what about the third pillar? The third pillar is contradictions. And the general response is that the various alleged contradictions can usually be plausibly harmonized or explained without positing that there is actually a contradiction there. For example, the question of were plants made before mankind, as Genesis 1, the P account says, or was it after mankind, as Genesis 2 seems to say? Genesis 2:5 says that no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground. Now, Cassuto argues that the first plant is actually a plant that has to do with thorns. The second plant, translated in the, I'm reading the English Standard Version, small plant, has to do with plants that require cultivation, like barley and grains. And thorns and herbs later become a part of the curse on man, thorns to trouble him and herbs to sustain him outside, where by the sweat of his brow he will earn his living. But these were not necessary yet in the Garden of Eden before the fall. But all the other plants could well have already been created. Moreover, the context may be limited just to the Garden of Eden. Outside there may have been thorns and thistles and grains, but not in the Garden of Eden. Even in the Garden of Eden, it may mean something, the word translated small plant, or referring to grains, may refer to fields of grain. There may have been individual barley or wheat plants, but there were no fields of it because man had not yet been created to cultivate the land in that way. What about the forming of animals before man, as Genesis 1, the so-called P account says, or forming the animals after man, as Genesis 2 would seem to indicate? And it turns out that there are at least three plausible explanations for this. One explanation is that the creation of animals after man in Genesis 2 may be a special case for the Garden of Eden. There may have been other animals outside of the garden, but God made animals for some additional animals for Adam to name. That's one possibility. Another possibility relates to how the NIV has translated Genesis 2:19. It translates it as a flashback, what we'll call later synoptic, resumptive, expansive storytelling. It translates it as a pluperfect, that God had formed out of the ground all the beasts of the field and all the birds of the air. Other versions would say that simply that God formed, as if it were the next thing, but they translate it as if it's flashing back to Genesis 1. And if you translate it that way, then there's no problem, no contradiction. But my teacher, Hanan Brichto of Hebrew Union College, pointed this out. He said that mankind was made after the animals in Genesis 1, but it's mankind, man is male and female. And even in Genesis 2, man is male and female only occurs after the other animals are made and named by Adam. In other words, Eve comes after the animals, even there, and therefore man as male and female comes after the animals. And again, since there's no contradiction, there's no need to posit different sources on the basis of contradiction. Moreover, source critics miss a literary style known as synoptic resumptive expansive storytelling. Or we'll simplify that, we'll just call it resumptive repetition. Resumptive repetition is a very common style in biblical narratives, though source critics, and to be honest, many conservatives tend to miss it. The technique is to tell a story once and then to flash back and retell the story again, either to expand on it or to tell the story from a different point of view. Source critics wrongly see the two as conflicting or divergent sources whenever this happens. So when you tell a story once and then you tell it again, well, it must be two different authors, two different sources. But rather, this can be a literary technique practiced by one author, a single author, and it's a technique akin to flashback. And the very first example of it happens in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I posit to you that this is not the first thing that happens in creation. This is a summary of the whole account. And then the 6 days that follow represents a resumptive and expansive telling of that story. We've tried to show that Genesis 1 and 2 begins with synoptic, resumptive, expansive storytelling, and it continues that way in later in chapter 1, where it says God created man, male and female, in his own image. This arguably is a synoptic account of the creation of mankind, whereas Genesis 2 would be resumptive and expansive, giving more details from a different point of view. Thus, Genesis 1 and 2 are not two creation accounts, but one story told using synoptic, resumptive, expansive repetition. Again, you tell the story once, then you pick up some details and you tell it again. This also happens in Genesis 15. Source critics see two sources, but arguably it's one story told twice to portray the same event from different points of view. Here's the account, and I'll pause, and actually you should pause the video and read these verses, and then we'll discuss them. Now, in Genesis 15, you have, according to the Wellhausian critics, two different accounts that contradict each other. In verse 6, Abraham believes God, and it's reckoned to him for righteousness. But when you get to verse 8, he's back in unbelief. What happened? In verse 5, it's already dark. You can see the stars. But in verse 12, the sun is not yet gone down. And so from these contradictions, they posit that there are two different sources. Wellhausen identified verses 1 through 6 as E, and he identified verses 7 through 21 as J. But you don't really need to do that. If you look at the outline of the passage here, this is after Gordon Wenham. He shows that the two parts of the chapter, verses 1 through 6 and verses 7 through 21, parallel each other. You have the beginning of each set of verses with Yahweh's word, promise of reward in verse 1, promise of reward in verse 7, then Abram's word, where he complains about lack of seed in verses 2 and 3. He wants some sort of guarantee in verse 8. Then Yahweh's reaction gives a promise about an heir in verse 4, gives an oath, or commands an oath rite to be performed in verse 9. And then there's a public act. Abram goes outside to look at the stars in verse 5. He begins the oath rite, carrying out the oath rite in verses 16 and 17. Then Yahweh gives a word. He promises the seed in verse 5. He promises the land in verse 13 through 16. And then each has a conclusion. In the conclusion, Abraham believes God, has faith. And the conclusion of 7 through 21 is God makes a covenant with Abram. One can argue that this is a case of resumptive repetition, where the two accounts are describing exactly the same event. Though in the first telling of the story, it's from the angle of the seed promise, and from the second telling of the story, it's from the angle of the covenant and land promise. And if you posit that that's what's going on, then everything resolves in terms of contradictions. So when verse 7 begins, it's flashing back to before when Abraham believed God and back to when he was still showing unbelief. It flashes back to before the sun had set and the stars had come out. In other words, verses 1 through 6 gives the bottom line that Abraham believes God. Verses 7 through 21 gives more details on how he came to believe God. And that this involved God's making a covenant with him. Thus, this third pillar from Contradictions and Divergent Viewpoints also proves to be unsound. Well, what about the fourth pillar? Well, the fourth pillar has to do with doublets. Are there two creation accounts, a doublet? No, we've already argued that it's really two accounts of the same story using synoptic, resumptive, expansive storytelling. In Genesis 1, you're given a more general account, a little bit semi-poetic account. In Genesis 2, you resume and expand that account to focus in on man and how Eve was, how man became male and female with the creation of Eve. There's no need to posit different sources or authors. Well, what about the wife-sister motif in various parts of Genesis, where twice Sarah and once Rebecca were passed off as the sister of their husband and almost were lost to foreign kings? Well, it's certainly a very unusual thing that's described here, but it's not impossible for such things to happen even 3 times over 2 centuries. History is full of improbable things happening. The stories actually reflect the purposes of a single author who's trying to draw attention to similarities in these incidents in order to further a literary purpose. Whybray puts it this way. He says the repetition of what is basically the same story is integral to the literary effect intended by the author. He was deliberately drawing attention to the theme of God's preserving his promise to Abram by informing his readers that God intervened not once, but 3 times to ensure the fulfillment of the promise of progeny. Thus, the fourth pillar from Doublets is also not conclusive. Well, what about the last pillar from composite sections? First of all, a general remark. Source critics destroy the aesthetic beauty of biblical narratives by assigning sections or even single verses or even parts of verses to diverse sources. They destroy the symmetry, the beauty, the logic of the narratives. With the flood account, They miss the coherent chiasm that suggests that this is not a scissors and paste editing, but is the work of a single author. Let me continue the case against composite sections by showing how the documentary hypothesis misses the coherence of the flood narrative as shown in its chiastic structure. Bernard Anderson portrays that chiastic structure as follows, seeing it as centered around God's remembrance of Noah, and there's a symmetrical structuring of it. Other scholars have seen the same thing. Gordon Wenham just looks at the timing elements of it, where you begin with 7 days of waiting for the flood, then at the end you have 7 days of waiting, and then another 7 days of waiting, and another 7 days of waiting, and 7:10 and 8:10, and then 40 days of flood before the flood, and 40 days of wait after the flood, and 150 days of the waters triumphing, and 150 days of the waters waning, and then in the center of all that, God remembers Noah. Again, highly symmetrically organized. He actually gives a much more detailed sequence of chiasm that starts with, goes from A to P and all the way back to A, where A is parallel with A prime, B is parallel with B prime, on through the entire list. And the point is this. This chiastic structuring shows that this is not just random cutting and pasting. Indeed, a writer with such a mastery over his material can no longer be simply called an editor. He's clearly an author. And there's no need to see contradictions in the flood story, since the chronology in the text is in fact consistent within itself. So some final remarks regarding the documentary hypothesis. Wellhausen grew up with an anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish bias of the Lutheranism of his day. And for that reason, Wellhausen preferred the simple religion of the patriarchs to the ritualized later religion of Judaism. And so for Wellhausen, primitive meant good, ritualistic meant evil. And so he preferred to see the original Mosaic religion as more primitive than the highly ritualized religion we find in the Pentateuch's so-called priestly sections. Now, this doesn't prove he was wrong in seeing the priestly sections as late, but does help explain why he came to be wrong. He wanted that material to be late. We should point out that the Katifi known silver amulets that we spoke of in terms of the text of the Old Testament also speaks against the documentary hypothesis. These silver amulets have a quotation from Numbers chapter 6, and that's a part of P, but it dates to the 7th century BC, which predates Wellhausen's date for P. At the very least, proponents of the documentary hypothesis have to say that at least that portion of P existed earlier before the exile. But perhaps the whole hypothesis that P is late is the fundamental problem. So how sound is Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis? I would argue that it's not very sound at all. So where does the documentary hypothesis stand from here now that things have proven unstable? Well, many liberal Bible scholars still accept this hypothesis despite its weakness, simply because they don't have anything better to replace it with. Some modify it in various ways. Some divide J into two sources, Eisfeld and Forer. Some reject the distinction of JE, but accept it as a single source, to which D and P have been added, and thus they have returned to the supplemental hypothesis. Some have de-emphasized written sources and opted for oral ones. We saw that with Gunkel and form criticism. Quite a few non-evangelical scholars, though, have been moving farther and farther away from Wellhausen, and you can see some of the names of people. I've quoted Whybray. Again, he's a critical scholar, liberal scholar, and yet wrote one of the more definitive repudiations of the documentary hypothesis in 1987. Now, conservative scholars have largely rejected the JEDP theory from the get-go, but even they have increasingly come to recognize that there are some post-Mosaic editings of the Pentateuch. So let's look at things from a more conservative point of view now and talk about the authorship of the Pentateuch. First of all, I'll review the traditional view, but then I will give you reasons why I think it needs to be modified. The traditional view of the authorship of the Pentateuch is simply that Moses wrote it. Jewish and Christian tradition ascribes the book to Moses. For example, in the Apocrypha, Ecclesiasticus says, all this is in the book of the covenant of the Most High God, the law that Moses commanded us. It associates Moses with those laws. Philo does the same thing, so does Josephus, so does Jewish tradition in the Mishnah. And there are certain older English Bibles that would identify the book of Genesis as the first book of Moses. Jesus connects Moses with Pentateuchal teaching. Matthew 8 and verse 4, show yourself to the priests and offer the gift of Moses commanded. Well, Jesus seems to ascribe to Moses the command to offer that gift in the Pentateuch. And Matthew 19 verse 8, Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, referring to Deuteronomy 24. And Mark 7:10, for Moses said, honor your father and mother, is quoting Exodus 20 and verse 12. And anyone who curses father and mother must be put to death, quoting Exodus 21 verse 17. And then John chapter 5, if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. Now, if you are to say that Moses had nothing to do with writing the Pentateuch, you'd have to say that Jesus was wrong, it would seem. Now, there is evidence even within the Pentateuch of Moses' writings. Scripture attributes to Moses the writing of various laws from Exodus through Deuteronomy. And Moses is later on associated with a book in Joshua chapter 1, the book of the law, and in 2 Chronicles and Ezra speaks of the book of Moses. Even within the narratives, Moses is told to write things occasionally. So in Exodus 17, God tells Moses, write this, meaning an account of the battle, as a reminder in a book, and recite it in the hearing of Joshua. A single narrative seems to unite the entire Pentateuch, and that suggests unity of authorship in some sense. So if Moses is the book of Moses, then why couldn't it just be that Moses wrote the whole thing? Moses certainly was educated in the royal household of Pharaoh, as he was raised by Pharaoh's daughter, would have received an Egyptian education, and would have been qualified to write. But there are problems with the traditional view, and we'll have to talk about that in the next video. I'll now continue with our discussion of how conservatives can view the authorship of the Pentateuch. We presented the case for the Mosaic authorship, But there are problems with that view that forces us to modify it. First of all, the text of Genesis itself is silent. It never says that Moses wrote Genesis. And it's doubtful that Moses wrote the account of his own death in Deuteronomy 34. And there's also evidence of post-Moses editing. For example, it refers to Dan in Genesis 14:14, that Abram chased certain kings of the east all the way to Dan. Well, Moses could not have referred to the city as Dan because in his day it was called Laish. The Danites conquered it, and it was the name was changed from Laish to Dan in Judges chapter 18, long after Moses' death. And so that implies that this statement must have been made after the time of the Judges. There's a statement about Edomite kings, and that these reigned before an Israelite king reigned. Well, why would Moses make that kind of statement? Rather, this was written by somebody for whom it was assumed that Israelite kings were reigning. And thus it's after the time of David and Solomon and the rise of the monarchy that this statement would have been made. There's other little indications of post-Mosaic editing. Reference to the Chaldeans in Genesis 11:31. Chaldean is a late term that would not have been known by Moses, or was not occupied by Chaldeans at the time of Moses. The earliest evidence for Chaldeans showing up in history is around 850 BC, centuries after Moses, though Ur was occupied by Chaldeans later on in history. And so this reference to Chaldeans implies a date sometime in the monarchy, around the 8th century or so, when Ur ceased to be an important city, and you would add the expression of the Chaldeans to distinguish that Ur from an Ur up in Syria. Another indication of post-Mosaic editing, the land of Ramses in Genesis 47:11, seems to be anachronistic, since Pharaoh Ramses is in the 13th century, well after the time of the patriarchs. Moreover, Ramses may well be after the time of Moses. If you date things from 1 Kings chapter 6:1, it says Solomon began building the temple 480 years after the Exodus. Well, if you take those numbers literally, that would place the Exodus in the 1400s BC, whereas Ramses lived in the 1200s. So that, again, looks like an updating of geographic terms for a later audience. Terms like Arameans and Philistines also seems to be late. Arameans are first mentioned in Assyrian inscriptions in the 12th century BC. Philistines are first mentioned around 1200 BC. And yet Genesis refers in the time of the patriarchs to Arameans and Philistines, who what we might call Proto-Arameans. Proto-Arameans would be really what at the time would have been called Amorites. Laban is called an Aramean. And Philistines would be Proto-Philistines who came from this place called Caphtor. And they would be Caphtorites who later came to be called Philistines, though in Genesis, at the time of the patriarchs, they would not have been. This implies a first millennium dating for Genesis. So this leads to what I call the modified traditional view. The modified traditional view says this: 1. Moses wrote all the laws as stated. 2. Moses wrote some narratives, might have even written the first draft of what became Genesis, using earlier traditions. But there has been post-Mosaic editing of the Pentateuch, updating geographic names and people groups so that later audiences could understand what was being referred to, updating the narratives for later audiences, And the narrator's voice would be an editor of Mosaic material and not simply Moses, especially true in Deuteronomy, where the editor seems to be a distinct voice from that of Moses. Why edit this material? To make it more relevant and clear for later readers. Or for the Jews in the first millennium would have been an obscure term, since it was no longer a major city and could be confused with an Ur up in Syria. But all educated people knew where the Chaldeans lived. They lived in Babylonia. And so adding of the Chaldeans clarified things for that later audience. It seems to me that this modified traditional view gives the most satisfactory approach to the question of the authorship of the Pentateuch. It accounts for more data than any of the other views, and it accepts what the New Testament has to say about Moses having something to do with the Pentateuch. This ends our discussion of the documentary hypothesis and the question of the authorship of the Pentateuch.